Note-taking in VGC has become less and less relevant with the introduction of open team sheet style tournaments. In fact, some high-level players decide not to take notes at all during their sets. However, there are still many benefits to taking notes that can help you step up your game during tournaments. I'm just going to go check on the cat real quick. In today's video, we will be going over what to write down, what not to write, the official rules on note-taking, and of course, some quick tips and tricks to help you out along the way. The best way to approach this is for me to go through my normal note layout, just to ensure that I do not miss any key points along the way, but please keep in mind there are numerous layouts and ways to write this information down, so feel free to find a way that feels comfortable for you. As always, if there is anything you think I may have missed or want to add, feel free to start a conversation in the comments down below. To begin, I like to write down the 6 opposing Pokemon. Innovative. I know. Here I like to leave some space for any notes that may occur mid-game. We will get into this more later on. During this time, you can also write down Terra types and or items. However, I personally do not, since this information will be on the team sheet already. Unless, of course, there is something weird, unusual, or super important that I really want to make sure I remember for later on. Below this section, generally on the second half of the page, I like to leave myself space for the 3 separate games during a best of 3. This is where I would write down lead Pokemon for both myself and my opponent, followed by the Pokemon in the back as they get revealed. Here's what my notes look like in real life, although I don't expect anyone to be able to read my writing because honestly, I can't either sometimes. Now that we have our basic layout down, it's time to take a look at writing what we need to know during the set. We will start with the bottom half of the page. In terms of which Pokemon Terras, I like to add that just above or below the Pokemon with the word Terra. You can take this a step farther and mark down which turn if you'd like, although I find that to be a bit more time consuming than helpful. As Pokemon in the back get revealed during the game, I make sure to write that down as well. Personally, I like to show which side the Pokemon switches in on. So for example, if a Whimsicott were to switch in from Miraidon, I would mark down Whimsicott below the Miraidon as opposed to below the other lead Pokemon. This is not a necessity by any means, however I do find it helpful as the set continues to be able to get a feel for how my opponent is playing and help with reading switches in games 2 and 3. Well, in this section, other things you can do are cross off the Pokemon that as they faint, which I personally recommend, or a more advanced option would be to tally turns of Tailwind, Trick Room, Perish Song, or any other things that are on a turn-based timer. Yes, these are displayed in-game, but however, you cannot check this information when on the Pokemon switch-in screen, so it can be helpful at that. This is excessive and I rarely do this myself, but it can be helpful for focusing if you are not fully locked in and you want to make sure that you are not missing something. Jumping back up to the top of the notes now, here's where I like to write 2 main things. Number 1 being relevant speed tiers. For example, this Pokemon may be slower than my Rillaboom. I'll be sure to jot that down. Or, a more complex example, this Pokemon is slower than Calyrex Shadow when it is in Tailwind. These interactions are very helpful to know when making future decisions within the game and are important to jot down. The second thing I like to note is damage calcs. And here guys, it's important to make sure you are not writing down obvious damage calcs because we all know Choice Specs TU is knocking out your Miracle Seed Rillaboom with a Heat Wave or an Overheat. Now on the other hand, if your Rillaboom happens to live, you write that down. However, a more practical example of this is calcs that may not be as obvious, like Astral Barrage being a 3-hit knockout instead of a 2-hit knockout like you were expecting, or anything similar. This will not only help you remember these calcs for later on in the game or the set, but also help you figure out how your opponent's Pokemon may be trained, whether it is perhaps bulkier or more offensive depending on the damage. Moving on to some helpful tips when taking notes. Do not write a novel. Writing too much is time consuming, annoying, and it will ultimately distract you from the game. Not only will you not have time to write it down, I can assure you, you won't have time to read it back during the game. What is too much or not too much is entirely subjective to you. I like to keep my notes short, brief, and quick. However, you can write a little bit more, and I have seen players reach great success with a little bit more than what I tend to write in my note. Number 2 being, do not write down obvious stuff or copy the team sheet, guys. And I hinted at this one earlier. You should be using the team sheet as that reference. It's there for a reason. There's no reason to straight up copy it. You know, you should be writing stuff down that is surprising or weird. like Incineroar, it's going to know the move Fake Out. There's no need to write that down. However, if they don't have Fake Out, that is something, in my opinion, that you should be jotting down. Shorthand and abbreviations are your friend. There are tons of options when it comes to this. For example, my Rillaboom gets shortened into Rilla when I write my notes. The only things to keep in mind here are to make sure you are able to recognize your short forms right away. Not being able to figure out what you mean if you just wrote down Green Dude, let's say when you get to game 3, and you're going back and you're like, who's Green Dude from game 1, will be a problem going forward, no matter how fast it is to write as compared to something else. Write down your notes in between turns or when given time. Maybe when your opponent is deciding what Pokemon to swap in or during the knockout animation. The key point here is not to miss anything happening in the game. You don't want to be in a scenario where you are writing notes and then looking back at your screen and going, what did that Calyrex click again? I didn't see it. You definitely do not want to be in that position, so make sure you are only writing down your notes when you are given the time to and when the game allows it in order for you to not miss any information. This one I've seen people struggle with before, and that is do not worry if you forget to mark something down. The game is the most important part. That should be your number one priority. There are tons of games where I forget to mark down certain things that I would normally enjoy writing down, like a potential Terra that happened during the game. However, do not let yourself get distracted. I have seen players crumble when they look at their notes and just didn't write something, and that is definitely not what you want to be doing. The game is the number one priority. If you miss something, you can always fill it in between games or just simply leave it out. It's not that big of a deal. Dictate what happens on important turns. For example, did they make the safe play or the aggressive play when the choice was there? Do they blink before they switch out every single time? Basically, what I'm trying to say here is you can make this as complex or as straightforward as you like, and it is entirely personal preference. For me, I do not bother writing any of this down, and I just prefer to make a mental note of this rather than wasting time writing. Feel free to write stuff down afterwards. If there is a game you really want to analyze more and look back at later, you can spend as much time filling in as much turn-by-turn info as you can remember after the game each set. While this is excessive more often than not, it can be helpful when seriously prepping for an event. I personally have never done this at a regional or higher level tournament. However, I will do this leading up to major events in some of these smaller tournaments, like a league challenge or a league cup, if there is a matchup that I am really interested in making sure that I know moving forward. Now, of course, note-taking in practice can also be very helpful, but that is a topic for a completely different day. Time to take a quick look at the rulebook here, and I will leave the exact quotation on the screen from the rulebook, but there are two key points to this. The page must be blank going into the round, and you cannot reference your notes from previous matches or other aids. For this, I have two recommendations. I recommend a smaller notebook, probably a little bit smaller than your standard 8.5-11 sheet of paper. You do not need a lot of space to write these notes, especially if you are good with your shorthand and your abbreviations. And also, sometimes space can just simply be limited at events. With all the cables and the switch dock set up, you may not have a lot of space to take a huge notebook or a regular size notebook to the event and be comfortable with writing notes. So I do recommend something a little bit smaller. I also recommend a coiled spine or a bendy spine, just basically something that you can bend if your notes are taken in a form of a book. This is going to just simply save paper and allow you to basically write one game per side or one set per side and simply fold your notebook over halfway through rather than having to flip the entirety of the page going into the next set. Because if you do have your previous set on the left side of the notebook, let's just say, you can't have that out even if for this set you are writing on the right side of your notebook. You need to have a completely separate clean slate. So therefore I like having my notebook that, can bend or fold over. I do like the coiled spine. In conclusion, there are tons of different ways to take notes during your games, and no objectively correct way to do so, as it comes down to player preference more often than not. As mentioned in the beginning, some players do not even take notes and still perform incredibly well. Personally, I find it helpful for keeping me focused on the game at hand. Hopefully, something that I covered here today can help you improve at taking notes or the game in general. But with that said, if you do enjoy this type of content, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel, and of course, I really do appreciate it. But with that, I will catch you all in a future video.